The song Simon Bolivar, music and lyrics by Rubén Lina and Isadra Contreras, used by permission of the authors. Performed by Juan Carlos Cordero of La Paz, Bolivia.
Simón Bolívar, Simón, caraqueño americano, el suelo venezolano, le dio la fuerza a tu voz. Simón Bolívar, Simón, nació de tu Venezuela y por todo el tiempo vuela como candela tu voz, como candela que va señalando un rumbo cierto en este suelo cubierto de muertos con dignidad. Simón Bolívar, razón del pueblo profunda, antes que todo se hunda, vuelve de nuevo Simón.
Welcome to a very short podcast of Weaving the Iguayu, stories of faith, sacrifice, and martyrdom of the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. My name is David Stevenson. Last week, we heard about the Hacienda Peon economic farming system in which the Spanish government granted huge tracts of land to the sons of Spanish aristocrats, and how this resulted in something not much better than slavery for the vast majority of indigenous people. In 1807, Napoleon invaded Spain to increase his empire. Spain struggled to withstand this attack and called home most of its military from around the world to stop Napoleon. This left a huge power vacuum in South America. There was growing unrest in South America with Spanish rule, and the winds of independence were blowing throughout the continent. Clashes between the few remaining Spanish troops and local militia were occurring throughout South America. Also in 1807, a truly remarkable man returned to South America. Simon Bolivar was an aristocrat and liberal thinker. While Bolivar was born and raised in Venezuela, he spent many formative years being educated in Spain, and he was also influenced by the French Revolution. He had learned of the independence movements in the United States and the growing demand for democracy across North America and throughout Europe. Bolivar's personal hero was George Washington. Bolivar not only admired his military expertise in defeating the most powerful military in the world, but he was especially impressed by the fact that Washington walked away from power. The American Revolutionary Army wanted to make Washington the king of the United States, and all Americans recognized that it was Washington that held the Army together during the difficult times of the Revolution, and that the Army was what held the country together. He was truly the father of the country. The population would have gladly gone along with King George of the United States. But in a move that I believe was even more important than the writing of the Constitution, Washington walked away from the presidency after 8 years. There was nothing in the Constitution that required him to leave the office after 8 years. However, Washington knew that if he didn't walk away, the basic tenets and goals of this democratic experiment would die. So President Washington got on his horse, rode to Mount Vernon, and lived out his life away from politics and managed his estate. Simon Bolivar recognized what an amazing act of selflessness and empowerment of the people that was. Bolivar detested the Spanish colonialization of South America and strongly believed that it oppressed all involved. He began to foment an independent revolution in New Granada and defeated the Spanish in 1819 and helped organize a national congress within 3 years. Bolivar then moved on to his home country of Venezuela and won a battle against a huge Spanish force in 1821, which brought independence to Venezuela. He was offered the presidency of Venezuela, but he refused and moved on. He then led independence movements in Panama, Colombia, and Ecuador, each time winning independence from Spain, each time offered the presidency, and each time he turned it down. Bolivar and the Gran Colombia won independence for Peru in 1821. Once again, he was offered the presidency of Peru, and he refused, and he moved on. And finally, Bolivar and the Gran Colombia Army entered the most inaccessible country in South America, Upper Peru, which is now Bolivia. On December 9, 1824, the last great confrontation of the Wars of Independence took place, the Battle of Ayacucho, where Bolivar's army defeated the last Spanish colonial army in South America. On August 6, 1825, the National Constitutional Congress was called and a democratic constitution was developed, and the nation chose to name itself after Simon Bolivar. Because of the divisive nature of Bolivian politics, Bolivar accepted the presidency of Bolivia, but he stepped down 5 months later in December of 1826. Bolivar once again stepped down from a presidency, leaving the Bolivians to decide who the next president would be, and he returned to his role as president of Gran Colombia and attempted to unite the continent. The Gran Colombia was a foundation of what Bolivar hoped would be a union of independent nations in Latin America, and was its president from 1819 to 1830. It experienced some of the similar attributes and difficulties as the United States, with the divisions between those who wanted a loose federation of independent states and those who wanted a stronger, centralized federalist state. At the height of its power, John Quincy Adams, future President of the United States, claimed that Gran Colombia was one of the most powerful nations on the planet. Ultimately, the tensions between the different nation-states of South America resulted in the breakup of the Gran Colombia in 1830, but Bolivar had succeeded to bring independence, if not unity, to most of South America. Now, Bolivar has been frequently criticized by many, including myself as recently as last year, for the limited nature of the independence of democracy which he brought to these countries. In Bolivia, and I believe elsewhere, the democracy that Bolivar brought was a very, very limited democracy. The only persons with a vote in Bolivia were the Criollo and the Mestizos. The Criollo probably amounted to about 3 to 5% of the population, and the Mestizo population was probably no more than 5 to 8%. And the vote was only for the males. Thus, eligible voters probably represented around 5 to 8% of the total population. The indigenous, who probably represented about 85 to 90% of the population in 1825, were not given the vote. Consequently, life changed none at all for the indigenous with Bolivian independence. The people still lived in haciendas, under their patron masters, living in near slave-like conditions. Now, I've always assumed that the main reason the indigenous were left out by Bolivar was because of racism. However, recently, I read a letter that Bolivar wrote while he was in exile in Jamaica during a low time for the Gran Colombia. The letter is dated September 6, 1815, Kingston, Jamaica. The following are excerpts from that letter. The link to it can be found at our website. Bolivar wrote, quote, 3 centuries ago began the atrocities committed by the Spaniards on this great hemisphere of Columbus. Our age has rejected these atrocities as mythical because they appear to be beyond the human capacity for evil. Modern critics would never credit them were it not for many and the frequent documents testifying to these horrible truths. The humane Bishop of Chiapas, the Apostle of America, De las Casas, has left to posterity a brief description of these horrors extracted from the trial records in Seville related to the cases brought against the conquistadors. Every impartial person has admitted the zeal, sincerity, and high character of that friend of humanity who so fervently and so steadfastly denounced to his government and to his contemporaries the most horrible acts of murderous frenzy. Bolivar continues, the veil has been torn asunder. We have already seen the light, and it is not our desire to be thrust back into darkness. The chains have been broken. We have been freed. Now our enemies seek to enslave us anew. For this reason, America fights desperately, and seldom has desperation failed to achieve victory." And he continued, "The Viceroyalty of Peru, whose population approaches 1.5 million inhabitants, without a doubt suffers the greatest subjection and is obliged to make the most sacrifices for the royal cause. And although the thought of cooperating with that part of America may be in vain, the fact remains that it is not tranquil, nor is it capable of restraining the torrent that threatens most of its provinces." End of quote. When I read these lines and the whole letter, I see a man who does not distinguish between the Indians and the Criollo. They are all under slavery, and by specifically referring to De las Casas' description of the horrific treatment of the indigenous by the conquistadors, Bolivar implies his complete disgust with the whole system of the peones as developed by the Criollo. This reminded me of my American history. At the Continental Congress in the United States in 1776, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams wanted to include African slaves in independence and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there was no way that the Continental Congress would agree to a unanimous Declaration of Independence if it included independence and emancipation for the African slaves. The Southern colonies simply would not vote for it. And these great men had to choose between standing by their principles and there be no American Revolution, or compromise and leave the slavery problem to be solved by future generations. They chose to put off the question of slavery for as long as they could, and it would take a great civil war, the bloodiest war ever fought by the United States, to bring an end to slavery. I wonder if Bolivar didn't face the same issue. From this letter, he clearly abhors the inhuman treatment of the Indians. He also counts them as people, not animals or pieces of property. And yet there's very little, if any, evidence that he promoted equality and freedom for the indigenous people of South America. Whatever his personal views were, Simon Bolivar brought independence from Spain and democracy. But equality for women and for indigenous people would have to wait another 127 years. So while it didn't lead to any immediate change in the lives of the indigenous people, independence from Spain was, in fact, the first incremental step in that direction. Now the decisions and laws were made in Bolivia, not in far-off Spain. And if there was going to be changes, it would be done right there at home, not in Madrid. The first steps toward real freedom and equality for the indigenous people won't come until 1952, and the Revolutionary Land Reform Act in Bolivia becomes law and brings the vote to the indigenous people. But we will tell more about that in future podcasts. With this podcast broadcast, we end the first of 4 and maybe 5 main chapters in the story of the IEMB. As I mentioned in the first episode, history tends to be written from the perspective of the winners. This has been especially true when we talk about the history of South America. It has reflected the views of the valiant, courageous conquistadors who conquered and civilized and brought Christianity to the heathen, ignorant Indians. When in my opinion, and in the opinion of most modern scholars, it was in fact a bloody massacre and the enslavement of a continent. Their military victories were not so much because of the bravery of the conquistadors, but primarily because of the deadly pandemic of smallpox which they brought with them that was 1,000,000 times worse than COVID-19, and there was also the superiority of their weapons, which included the horse. I also wanted to show that the Hacienda Patron peon economic and cultural system was not the idyllic period of giant homes and women in fabulous dresses and riding in horse-drawn carriages and drinking coffee and watching the happy peons gladly working for their patron and protector. Instead, it was a time of deprivation, a form of slavery with beatings, rape, and abuse of the indigenous people by the Criollo. As I said in the first episode, this first chapter was an attempt by a gringo to tell a quick and more accurate early history of Bolivia from the perspective of the indigenous peoples, and to provide the historical context for the coming life stories of the early Methodist missionaries and the earliest indigenous members of the IMB. The next episode will begin our second major chapter of the history of Bolivia. It will be at least 7 episodes long, stretching into February. It will tell the life stories of these early Methodist missionaries who came to Bolivia beginning in 1906 and the mission they attempted to carry out. This will be perhaps the most controversial chapter. There are, in fact, many different and changing perspectives on this history. I'm going to try to communicate that history through 2 perspectives, 2 sets of eyeglasses, that of the missionaries and their families, and that of the indigenous Methodists. And I will give brief nods to some other perspectives. I will tell these stories through the life stories of those who lived it. But I am strongly influenced by the indigenous Methodists, and that will be where the emphasis will be. In the coming 7 episodes, which cover the years of 1906 through the 1950s, you will hear about the dangers the U.S. missionaries faced, the opposition of the government and the Catholic Church to Methodism, about a U.S. Methodist missionary punished and sent home because of his successful mission to the indigenous of the Altiplano, and the controversial and contradictory reasons for his removal. You'll hear the story of El Redentor, the Andes Church, which was the first church established in all of Bolivia specifically for the indigenous people. You'll hear the story of the first rural indigenous Methodist, Tata Cipriano, and the persecution he and his family experienced throughout his life. You'll hear the amazing story about a man nicknamed Feliciano, or Happiness, whose imprisonment led to a siege and the ransacking of Ancareimas by 10,000 campesinos. And you will learn how the Methodists helped to create a democratic revolution in Bolivia from the top down, not the bottom up. Our third chapter, of unknown length, will be about the Aymara Revolution within the IMB and the many views and opinions of those involved, and how that revolution rapidly changed the IMB from a Criollo missionary, primarily urban church into an indigenous, primarily rural church that it is today. And the fourth and final chapter, probably beginning in April or May, I will finally get to the stories I most want to tell and which compelled me to do these podcasts. It will be about how the IMB became one of the leading voices for democracy and human rights of the indigenous people. It will tell the amazing life stories of members of the IMB who were persecuted and arrested by taking brave and dramatic stands for those rights. And it will tell the stories of the Bolivian Methodists who suffered arrest, torture, and even martyrdom for opposing various Criollo right-wing military dictatorships. This final chapter will include some of the most dramatic, powerful, emotional, true stories of Methodist Christians remaining faithful to God and to the church despite arrests, tortures, exiles, and even martyrdom. And it will include a special 3 to 5 episode long story told in a docudrama, hour-by-hour format of the arrests and tortures of Methodists all across Bolivia during the coup of the last Bolivian right-wing dictator, Generalissimo Garcia Mesa, beginning on July 17, 1980. This past week, I produced the second bonus podcast of the Iguayu Ayu. It is the story of Dr. Bill Strassniner, an engineering PhD student and then professor who decided he wanted to take on the huge, untried task of cleaning up a river of acid in the mining area near to Potosi and Cerro Rico. This water was so acidic, It's hard to explain. Battery acid has a pH of 0. The water flowing in the open river in the valleys and through the villages had a pH of 0.5. And there was an apocryphal story told to us about how locals, if they wanted to burn boils or things like that off of their skin, would simply place their hand in the water and it would burn it off. You will hear about Dr. Strossnider's plans, his partnership with Engineers in Action, and the problems we faced. You will also hear about a protest march that shut down the state or departmental capital of Potosi and the kidnapping of the departmental minister of mines. And you will hear about, when I arrived in La Paz a few days later, the president of the Potosi Rotary Club called me and said, "David, you and Dr. Strossnider caused this protest and the shutting down of Potosi and the kidnapping, and you have to fix it." What? You will hear why he felt that way and what we did about it. Thank you for listening, and I will see you again when we begin to tell the stories, both good and bad, of the early Methodist missionaries.